Thank you, and welcome to everyone who's here. It's such a pleasure and an honor to once again be talking to Puerto Rican judges. And thank you, of course, to the Judicial Academy for inviting me back. I wish I could be there in person, but times are what times are. It's such a pleasure to be able to talk to you again. So I'd like to begin with a few words and then how we're going to run it. There will be time for questions at the end, but because 2 hours is a long time, I think, for anyone, if you have a question, to be waiting, you can always put your questions in the Q&A, and then I will stop periodically after a large segment of the presentation, and we can deal with the questions you want to deal with immediately. And then if you would rather hold your questions until the end, we'll do that too, right? So this first slide is talking about communities, LGBTTQI plus communities, and that's a deliberate choice, because we often think of sexual orientation or gender identity minorities as a big group of people. And of course, it is a big group of people with many things in common. But the truth is that in fact, like any group of people, one, are individuals, but two, people have groups within larger communities. And in fact, should you attend my next talk, which is in 2 weeks, when we're talking about violence and how violence is affected by gender and gender identity, we will see that there are sometimes very important differences between how lesbians are treated, how gay men are treated, how trans persons are treated, even in the same context or the same sort of general vicinity. So that's why it's communities. And that's an important point, I think, to keep in mind. So here are the images. And if you were here last time, I think I showed these same pictures, because the truth is these are the images that people have about LGBTQI people. We get them from TV, we get them from entertainment. So the group here is, of course, on the far left. The Will and Grace. In the center, of course, is Caitlyn Jenner, who is probably the most famous transgender woman, but probably one of the least representative of transgender women. And by the way, running for governor in my state, California. So we'll see what happens there. And then, of course, Ricky Martin, who is, your Supreme Court justice aside, probably the most famous LGBT Puerto Rican. None of these people are particularly typical of who will be in your courtroom. I mean, I suppose it's possible for some celebrity to be in your courtroom, but it is not too likely. And that's important because these media images are often of gay people, and they are what I think of as the Will and Grace version of gay people. White, rich, from cities, preoccupied with fancy clothes, gourmet meals, going to, well, at least pre-pandemic, going to exotic locations, expensive vacations. The truth is, of course, is that while there are some people who are like that, that's not really who people are. And those are probably not going to be the folks in front of you in your courtroom. Here's a group of pictures, by the way, taken from an LGBT organization there in Puerto Rico. And this is much more representative. But when you look at it, there are some things that's different about this group of people. You don't have to put your answers in the Q&A. If we were live, I would ask for your thoughts. But what I see about this group of people is that they're almost all male. There are some women. They're all young. And the question is this really a representative group? And that's what I would like to start with. Our discussion is going to be, what do we know about the LGBTQI population in Puerto Rico, and then larger in the United States in general, right? And so that's where I will begin. So what do we know? One of the most interesting things that's happened since I spoke to you last, actually, has been the increase in number of LGBT people from 3.5, 3.6 in 2012 and 2013 to 5.6 in 2020. Now that's an interesting thing because generally speaking, populations are fairly stable. But what this I think shows is a couple of things. One, it could show an increase in people, and we'll talk more about that. But it can also show an increase in the ability of people to feel comfortable enough to identify themselves as LGBT to Gallup, the poll, Gallup poll. But it does show an increase in something else. And this is this next piece of the slide. So on the left is another census. General Social Survey is a census product from the US Census, and it shows the 2008, 2012 percentage. And the one to the bar to the right shows the same statistics in 2014 and 2018. And what you see there is, yes, there's a little bit of a change for people, if you can see my cursor, for people who are lesbian or gay. But the big change, and it's a dramatic one, is in people who identify as bisexual. Now, this is US data, but honestly, I cannot imagine that Puerto Rico is any different in this respect. There's an enormous increase in people who identify as bisexual. And I think what that means for you as judges is that you might see a same-sex couple and you can identify them as a same-sex couple because they're a family. But a bisexual couple is not necessarily visible to you as a judge. Because in fact, one of the pieces of data that we know is that many, if not most, bisexuals are in fact in relationships with people of the opposite sex. So that bisexual women tend to be either married or in a relationship with men, and bisexual men tend to be married or in a relationship with women. And so therefore, you may in fact have people in your courtroom who are in fact members of the LGBTQ community, and you wouldn't know. And maybe it doesn't matter, but maybe it does. And that's the kind of things that I want to talk about today. So we can see this. So this is the same survey, just presented the data in a different way. And what you see is among people who identify as LGBT, right? Lesbians, gay men, male bisexuals, female bisexuals. This is the same data period, 2008 to 2012. When we look at the 2014 to 2018 data, these triangles are pretty much the same, but the big increase is in, once again, bisexuals, and particularly bisexual women. Now that's important in Puerto Rico because in fact, as we're going to see, there are many more LGBTQ women in Puerto Rico than there are men, right? So the idea that over time, bisexual women have increased is something which we would then see show up in the island as well. So I have something which is going to be a poll. The question. So I'm a law professor. Sorry, I have to ask questions. I don't expect you to know the answer. In fact, I don't care whether you know the answer in the beginning. What I care about is what you think the answer is, because what is true is the way we think about a problem colors the way we see the data, the information, the people in front of us. So I'm interested in hearing from you. What percentage of Puerto Rican municipal areas include at least one same-sex couple? This data, by the way, is from the census, and we'll talk about that. So I wonder if Luis, you can put up the poll, please. So if you wouldn't mind ringing in to the poll. The time is almost up. Okay, I think Luis will stop the poll and show. So what you see, 50% of you said 100%. The second group is 35, and then lesser things. In fact, of course, we can stop sharing, please. So you shared the results. I think I just need to get, I don't know whether I can do this, get rid of the poll, can I? Yes, okay, good. So then, the answer, in fact, is 100%. And what's interesting to me about the answers is that the early people who rang in were at 100%. And then if you notice, as other people came aboard and decided on what their answers were, the number of 100% went down and the number of less than 100% went up. That, by the way, is really, really typical. You all as judges are consistent with every time I've ever asked this question. And that's an interesting thing, because we don't ordinarily think that in fact LGBT people, or in this case same-sex couples, live everywhere. But of course they do. Your conscious mind may know that, but the way you feel about it, it just may seem like that's got to be the wrong answer. But in fact, that's true. It's not true that every place is the same in terms of percentage. And that's actually the next slide I want to show you. So if we ask, where do people live who are same-sex couples in Puerto Rico? What we see is certain areas more so than others. So kind of interestingly enough, not necessarily big cities, although of course, San Juan and other surrounding areas are one of the darker areas. And we have to be, there's one caveat I want to say about this kind of a photo. First of all, it shows you the island in some places more than others. We have to be careful about areas with small populations, because if the population is small, it doesn't take too many same-sex couples for there to be a big percentage of the population, right? So some of these areas like the islands, Culebra, for example, that's probably more what's going on there than in fact it seems to be a hotbed of LGBT people. It could be, but I would guess that that's what in fact is going on in that part of the Commonwealth. So remember, I told you that LGBT people in Puerto Rico tend to predominantly be women, right? This data is from the census. Now, so the problem with this data and I'll be very upfront with it. The problem with this data is it comes from the 2010 census, because of course, we don't have the information yet for 2020. And of course, if you think about all of the changes in Puerto Rico since 2010, including the big hurricanes, right, in 2017, the earthquake in 2020, and the changes in population that have been both off of the island and then some returning to the island from the mainland of the United States. There have been a lot of changes. I would not expect, however, that this data is going to change very much in the 2020 census. And that's because one of the things that we know about the migration from the island to Florida, to New York, to New Jersey, to the places where people go on the mainland, is that primarily it's younger people, primarily it's people with more ability to move, honestly, and that leaves Puerto Rico now with a population that's slightly older, slightly fewer resources, and there doesn't seem to be a gender difference. I guess that's the most important thing. It's not only men who are leaving or only women who are leaving, but rather it's people who can have the ability to move, to set up a new household in a different location, right? And so while this will change somewhat in the 2020 census, I don't imagine that the proportions will change much. And that's the very interesting thing about Puerto Rico. In general, in the United States, there are slightly more male gay men than lesbians. In some states, it's reversed, but in no place that I have ever seen has the imbalance between men and women been so strong as here in Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, I have no ability to tell you why. I can only tell you what. But I think what that means for judges is that unlike that picture that we saw on the third slide, right, the one of the group of Puerto Ricans taken from the website here in Puerto Rico, in which almost everybody was a man. In fact, that's not who's in your courtroom. You are much more likely to see members of the LGBTQ community, women, female couples, maybe, but women. And so that therefore, if you're looking for gay men, you may miss the folks who are actually in your courtroom who are members of those communities, okay? So now, because of this big difference, these next two maps are important. On the right here, right, this is where male same-sex couples live. And in a way, it's very kind of unsurprising. Here's San Juan, of course, and the general vicinity. But when we look at females, women who are part of the LGBT community live in different places than men. In other states, we find this difference, and it tends to be because women tend to live in more rural or suburban areas because of cost of living and other kinds of economic issues. That is true to some degree on these maps. I would obviously need to speak to someone who lives here who has a better sense of these municipalities, who could explain why, for example, we have a high concentration of women here. I don't know, perhaps you do, right? I have to apologize, by the way. I saw in the Q&A that there are people from other countries here, and welcome. I don't have this information. If you would like to talk to me afterwards, send me an email, and my contact information will be elsewhere at the end. I'd be happy to share with you what I know about the LGBT populations in other parts of Latin America or South America. But I don't have that information with me here today, sorry. So one other difference I think that shows up is that couples are different in terms of age, right? Now, this is because I think of two different things. So the green here are married different sex couples, right? And younger people, they're more younger people. And then as we go through the generations, that changes and goes down. If you notice, for same-sex couples, it's a very different kind of pattern. I think it's because two things are happening here. And for people in the older age groups, once again, this is the 2010 census, there is more of a reluctance to identify to the census or to people in general that you are a member of a same-sex couple or that you are LGBT, right? Younger people generally tend not to have the same issues because they grow up in a different culture. But at the same time, in 2010, there was no marriage for same-sex couples, of course, and people might enter these same-sex relationships at a later point in time because people come out later, because they might be uncomfortable in these situations. But by the time they get to their 30s and 40s, they have relationships the same way that heterosexual people might have relationships, right? So I think for you as a judge, looking at who's in your courtroom again, it's not true that there's nobody who's a senior, but it's more likely that the seniors that are there are not going to be visible to you. It is probably likely that when we're talking about people from 30 to 49, these are people having children, these are people having families, and therefore we have people who might in fact be in your courtroom for the typical things that families are in courtrooms for, divorces and other kinds of things like that, right? So this is simply another way of looking at the same things. It's not important, all the details. I'm happy to give any of these data slides to anyone who wants them. What I think is important about this is that in 2020, which is where this data comes from, you notice the enormous change in terms of generations, younger people versus older folks. And then once again, we see this increase in bisexuals, the sort of silent or hidden part of the LGBT TQI communities in younger age categories. In older age categories, it's not that different, but in younger age categories, it's enormous, right? And that so if you have an assignment or hear cases which gives you a wider exposure to younger people, you are much more likely to see these people in your courtrooms. So, yeah, there we know. All right, I have another slide for you. Right. So, if we could put up the poll, right? This is a question about, right, married same-sex couples who have kids under age 18. That's 57%. What do you think of the percentage of same-sex couples in Puerto Rico? This is Puerto Rican data. And once again, it's not the actual answer and your knowledge of the actual answer that matters to me. It's what you perceive to be based on your information and your exposure, what you think. Okay, we seem to have reached a stopping point. I'm going to end the poll. So by a slight majority, I say plurality, I guess it is, 28%. Folks said 11%, but pretty much people are split all the way across the board. And that's actually not surprising. There's no particular reason why you would know what the answer to this is. The actual answer, I'm going to close it, is 26%. So it's not actually all that different from what your expectations are, but it's a little higher. And I think that's the part that's important. In other words, we tend to think, of course, of different sex married couples as, of course, raising kids. What's true is, of course, that same-sex couples raise fewer kids, but not an insignificant number. 26%, about a quarter of same-sex couples are raising kids under the age of 18, which means, of course, that if you have a family case in front of you, or if you deal with juvenile cases, that in fact, you could be seeing children who are part of a family headed by two women. In Puerto Rico, it's more likely to be two women than two men, but of course it could be either one, right? So I have a question about, and we'll talk about this. So once again, we'll have a poll here. The question, if we could start the poll, the question is, what state or states are among the 10 highest states in the proportion of same-sex couples that are raising kids? All right, seems like people who wanted to ring in have wanted to. And so unsurprisingly, 94% of you said California. Right, you can see it now. There's a small percentage of people who said other states, but virtually everybody said California, right? And that makes sense. It's not true, however. The truth is, it's every state on that list anyway, but California. In fact, the top states, according to census data, is Mississippi, Wyoming, Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Kansas, North Dakota, Arkansas, South Dakota, Oklahoma, right? It's all states. Well, California, by the way, is 41st. And where's Puerto Rico? Well, we can't exactly tell because the data set that the original list comes from does not include non-states. That is, it does not include any of the insular possessions, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. On the other hand, we do have other data which can approximate the same thing. It's not exactly the same data, so you can't make a one-to-one comparison, but Puerto Rico is about 23 to 24%, which would put it right about here, 3 and 4. Now, what's going on here? Let me do this visually, and we'll get to Puerto Rico in a minute. If you see this map, we have a high concentration of same-sex couples raising kids here in the South, in the sort of upper Midwest plains, these places in which we don't ordinarily think of as being LGBT friendly at all. And in fact, they're not particularly in terms of law and other kinds of things. Think about why you think that might be true. If you'd like to put an answer in the Q&A, you can, of course. But just think about what's going on in these states. So it turns out in these states, which tend to be conservative, in which people tend to marry earlier in life, tend to be religiously focused, oftentimes, tend to have sort of cultural values that are fairly traditional. So people get married early, they have children early, sometimes outside of marriage, but okay. And that the LGBT people who grow up in these communities have also the same ideas. Now, someone mentioned economic circumstances, and that, of course, is true too. These places tend to be cheaper to live, but not all of them. It tends more to be about the values in the community, so that LGBT people who may have a child early in life, either because they're in a heterosexual relationship or maybe not, and they tend to come out later in life in these areas. And when they come out later in life, they bring the child who is biologically related to them, it's their child, into the same-sex relationship that they have. And that those relationships start later. And we saw that in that earlier slide, where when we talk about what same-sex couples look like versus married different sex couples, it's much higher in the 30 to 49 group. So these are people who have probably come out later in life, and they're bringing a biological child with them into their new relationship. When we look at the Puerto Rican data, right, you will know this much better than I, but when I look at this, partially it's economics, partially it's small percentages of people, but it's probably a similar thing. The center of the country tends to be much more conservative than the cities, certainly. And that you might ask yourself whether that explanation, which seems to be true for mainland US, is also applicable here in Puerto Rico. Because it's a pattern that we see in both red states and blue states. If we were to look at maps of California, for example, we would see that the more rural conservative areas of California have higher percentages of same-sex couples raising kids than certainly San Francisco or Los Angeles, right? So we'll see for yourself whether you think this is true here. And I think what we can see here, right, if we ask ourselves, who's raising kids in Puerto Rico, and who are they? Who are those children? What relationship do they have to the parents? If we're talking about different sex couples, unsurprisingly, 95% of them are biological children, and a much smaller percentage of adoption and foster children. When we look at same-sex couples, we see a much higher percentage of non-related, of foster children, of grandchildren, of stepchildren, but we still see a big percentage. 71% is a big number of people who are raising biological children who are biologically related to one member of that couple. Now, what does I think that mean for you as a judge? I think it means a couple things, but I think it means that in fact, these are not people who have adopted kids. These are not people who have sort of gotten their child from some other things. These are people who have a biological relationship to at least one of the parents. And then it also means that there may in fact be someone else who is not in front of you who has a relationship with that child. In other words, since it's likely that these are female couples here in Puerto Rico, we have a biological mother and we have another parent in the couple that you probably have in front of you. but there may be a biological father out there who may not in fact be in front of you in the divorce or whatever situation you're in seeing this child. Or for example, if it's a juvenile assignment and you have a child, they're biologically related to one of the members of the same-sex couple, but there may be, again, someone not in front of you who is raising or has some relationship anyway to that child, right? So what do we know sort of in summary? We know that parents who are LGBT in Puerto Rico tend to be women, tend to be younger, and tend to have socioeconomic characteristics of people who are more likely to be living in poverty. That means that if in your community you see couples going through a divorce or in some other way in which they're now accessing the court, the LGBT couples that you will see are more likely to have fewer resources than the heterosexual couple. And that may be particularly important because we know that people who come into court are usually coming into court because there's a crisis. That's true across the board. And therefore, these couples and their families may be less well equipped economically to deal with these crises. So let me say this. This is the couple from Modern Family, right? Mitchell and Cam, and their adopted baby from Vietnam. That's an old picture. It's okay. If the producers of Modern Family had really wanted to show the typical LGBT couple raising children, it probably wouldn't be this couple. They're male, right? They turns out in the show, they turn out to live in a very expensive part of Los Angeles, as it turns out. They have a stay-at-home husband, and the other husband works in a law firm. They've adopted their child from Vietnam. That's not the real Modern Family. The real Modern Family is probably two women of color raising a child biologically related to one of those mothers, and probably living in a suburban or rural area of their state. Right? So that would be a very different show, by the way. It would be a show closer to reality and honestly closer to the people you're going to see in your courtroom. So I'll stop here. This will be the first time that you have an opportunity to ask whatever questions you want to ask at this point. If you don't have any, that's fine too. But if you do, let's see. Well, so the question, as I understand it, that's currently in the Q&A, is that yes, the popular view of LGBT people is that they're left-wing and that they, live in urban and other kinds of communities, and that may or may not be true in general, but it doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of LGBT people who are themselves conservative in either other parts of their life, right? They certainly, I don't have statistics on this, but there are statistics in the United States generally about members of the LGBT community who are religious, who are conservative versus liberal, et cetera, and that you cannot know. I think the bottom line is you can't know just because of knowing someone's sexual orientation whether or not someone is in fact liberal, conservative, religious, non-religious. There's not always a match. I don't have statistics of trans mothers and fathers here with me. There are statistics, and if you're interested in them, I'm more than happy to share them with you. Honestly, they're not as good as the numbers that we have from the census. The census is a big population, so we are pretty confident that those numbers are accurate. The numbers for trans people tend to be surveys of trans people, as like transgender people, and therefore the data is less robust. I think is a statistical term for that, but okay. So the question is, how does the statistics about more lesbian mothers correlate to criticism to the patriarchy? I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know, except that because you're a lesbian mother doesn't, and it goes along with what we were just saying, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have political views or feminist views that are consistent with I don't know, sort of left-wing ideologies and other things like that. In other words, people become parents for lots of reasons. And sometimes I suppose it's a political statement, and sometimes it's in contrary to the political beliefs. But I don't know that we can generalize, or I certainly don't know the answer to that question. It is true, by the way, that there are people, there's a group of feminist lesbian scholars who believe that the focus on marriage is completely wrong, that the focus ought to be not on a woman, or for a man for that matter, but a woman entering into the traditional patriarchal relationship of marriage. This is their words, not mine, because in fact, I am married. And in fact, the law should recognize other types of families. I don't know if that is at all responsive to that question, but I think that you can't tell. I think like any group of people, lesbian mothers are just as diverse in their thought processes as other things. So there's a question again about trans people being able to adopt. I'd like to actually hold that question until the end, because adoption is actually one of the things that's relatively recent in Puerto Rico. And so I'm not sure there's enough data to be able to answer. My guess is, by the way, that that there's a gap between what the law says is possible and what people have the ability to do for all sorts of reasons. And so that although adoption is legal, it may very well be that trans people have a very hard time adopting. And that would not surprise me. There's a gap between what the law says is possible and what is really possible for people kind of on the ground. Yes, and I would agree with that there's a myth of your identity, either sexual orientation identity or gender identity, and your thought processes about other things, right? I think that that's true. All right, so let's continue. I want to talk now, and I want to, in general, for the balance of the time we have together, I'd like to talk about tools to provide greater access to a particular group of the LGBTTQIA communities, which is trans and gender nonconforming people. I think in many ways, the positions of lesbians and gay men and bisexuals, those are important issues, but that the issues that probably we need to think about before they show up in your courtroom are the ones dealing with trans and gender non-conforming people. So I want to talk about, first, sort of terminology and information and give you sort of data like that. And then we'll talk about best practices and tools. So in terms of this is a comic. I realize that the Spanish word for snowman isn't gendered in that way like it is in English. But I think the important part of this comic is the idea that we should be questioning our assumptions. And in fact, in some ways, that links back to what we're just talking about, that we ordinarily assume correlations exist between things that may not exist, in fact, at all, right? So we start with that. Let's talk about terminology. So this is a tool that I offer to you. It helps me, and that's why I'm offering it. But if it's not helpful to you, it's not helpful to you. It helps me, though, to sort out where my problem or where my issue that I'm trying to deal with, where that problem is in truth, and not get it confused with things that might be similar or maybe not even similar at all. And I think of this as sort of 4 lines or 4 spectrums. The first one is biological sex, or in the terminology that we use when we're talking about transgender people, the sex that one was assigned at birth. You can be assigned male, you can be assigned as a man, you could be assigned woman, you could be, in fact, an intersexual, which we're going to talk about, but that is someone whose genitalia is ambiguous, both male and female, or incomplete in that way, and that's one thing. The sex that you're assigned at birth, or your biological sex, dealing with chromosomes and genitalia, is one thing. That's different from the second line, which is gender identity, which is what you think in your head. Do you think of yourself as a man? Do you think of yourself as a woman? Do you think of yourself as some combination, or that's not the right concept for you, right? That's very different than your biological genitalia. It's very different than the sex that they assigned you at birth. And the two often coincide, but they don't have to, right? The third one, that's different though. The idea you have in your head is different from how you present yourself, which is how you express your gender, right? That has to do with, I don't know, facial hair, clothing, tone of voice, sometimes vocabulary, other times, lots of different things. It's sort of your outward presentation of gender. And that regardless of your gender identity, you could present in a more masculine way or a more feminine way, or both or neither, or somewhere in between, etc. And that all 3 of those things are different from sexual orientation, which is who you are emotionally and physically attracted to, right? Attracted to men, attracted to women, attracted to both, attracted to neither, attracted to trans people, etc. Excuse me. And that sexual orientation is different from any of the above. And that in fact, that's the important thing for me. So when I have a problem, I have to keep 2 things in mind. One is, because I know something about one of these lines, I don't necessarily know anything about any of the other lines, because in fact, they're not connected. That is to say, someone can have a gender identity of male, but express their gender in female kinds of clothing, right? And that they can be biologically male, and that doesn't tell you anything about their sexual orientation. Whether they're attracted to men or attracted to women or whatever. In other words, these are 4 independent concepts. So that when I'm looking at a problem and trying to solve a problem, I have to ask myself, what is this problem really about? Is it about a conflict between the sex someone's assigned at birth and the way they're presenting themselves in my courtroom? Well, I don't have a courtroom. In my classroom or your courtroom? Or is it about, excuse me, same-sex couples, and then it's really about sexual orientation? Or is it about, I don't know, gender-motivated violence? And I'm thinking about this as it has something to do with gender identity, and maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. But it helps me decide where it is that my problem lies. And then I can address that problem without being distracted by these other things. As I said, if this is helpful to you, great. If it's not helpful to you, forget it. But it's a tool that I use in solving problems myself when things come up. So the conference says LGBTTQI+. Right? It's a lot of letters. I think some of them are pretty familiar to us. I think the L, the G, and the B, I think are kind of familiar. I think we recognize probably the first T, which is a transgender person. A transgender person is an individual whose sex that they were assigned at birth or whose genitalia does not correspond to how they think of themselves in their head. So Caitlyn Jenner, for example, to use her, she was born with male genitalia. She was assigned the sex male at birth. And she says that she always identified in her earlier life as a woman. She always thought of herself as a woman because that is her gender identity, right? So that's what transgender means, right? Someone whose gender identity does not correspond to the sex that they were assigned at birth. Cisgender is a term that maybe some of you have heard about or idea, but it's a term that comes about because we have the term transgender. Trans is Latin for on the other side of something, so on the other side of gender, I suppose. Cross-gender in that sense. Cisgender, cis, the Latin term, is one that means on the same side. So a cisgender person is someone whose sex that they were assigned at birth is congruent or matches what's in their head in terms of how they think of themselves. I, for example, was born male. I think of myself as a man. I'm cisgender, right? So then, the other T in this is for transsexual. And this is kind of an interesting thing because in at least American English, in the people that I know, the word transsexual isn't used very much. Transsexual is a person whose sex they were assigned at birth is incongruent or does not match their gender identity. Typically, transsexual, the term used to refer to people who want to have a medical, make a physical transition in their body. It's a term that we don't use that much in American English, but it's a term that is used a lot and very neutrally in Spanish and in actually Brazilian, Portuguese, and other languages. In English, transsexual has kind of a negative connotation. It is like using the word homosexual instead of lesbian or gay. But in other countries, that's not at all an issue. And it does not appear to be, from my knowledge of Latin and South America. There's no negative connotation to that term here, which is kind of an interesting difference, just sort of sociologically and linguistically. Intersexual, I think I mentioned, and an intersexual is a person who was born with ambiguous genitalia. Typically, doctors then assign a gender to that individual, but that their genitalia may not, in fact, be neither all male or all female. And that's the meaning of that term. So there is an umbrella term which I tend to use and which I noticed in the Q&A some other people use. The umbrella term is trans, which encompasses more than just people who are transgender, but people whose gender identity, gender expression, gender doesn't match with the sex that they were assigned at birth. It's much more of an umbrella term. I tend to use it because honestly, transgender is kind of a mouthful, but even if it weren't, sometimes I mean more than just transgender people. I mean people who these issues are similar for them, even though they're not the same in that way. So now, The concept that may or may not be familiar to you is a gender non-binary. And the best way I guess I can think of to do this is to use kind of my own kind of personal history. When I was a kid, ages ago, when the dinosaurs were on this earth, when I was a child, I always thought of things as you were either a boy, blue, or you were a girl, pink. And in fact, in school, the boys had one line, the girls had another line. There was, of course, a boys' bathroom and a girls' bathroom. But there were, boys did certain things, they dressed certain ways, girls did certain things other ways. This is a binary conception. You're either blue or you're pink. You're either a boy or you're a girl, man or a woman, right? For people who are gender non-binary, they reject that concept of the either or, of the binary. For them, this is entirely the wrong picture. The picture is more like this. The gender is in fact a spectrum. And of course, there can be people who are 100% blue or 100% pink, but that in fact, there's a whole range of that combination. And that people who are gender non-binary don't think of the either or situation. They think of sort of the spectrum of gender, right? And that means, we can add a term up here, pansexual. You may have heard that term before. If you think about it, the term bisexual for people who are attracted to both men and women, by expressing it that way, you're assuming that there's either men or there's women, right? Bi, two, that works. For people who are in fact pansexual, I think they would say that I'm attracted to the range. Pan is Latin for all. The range of people on the gender spectrum, right? And so that it kind of matches this non-binary aspect, whereas bisexual tends to be a gender binary kind of idea. Okay, so gender non-conforming is similar but different. And once again, I'll go back to my childhood. I don't know, probably a psychologist could tell you there's some problem that makes me go back there in my explanations. But as a child, as I remember it, when we went out of school for recess, boys went over and they played ball and they did boy things. Girls went and played jump rope and did girl things. But there were always some girls who didn't want to play jump rope or do what girls did. They wanted to play ball with us, right? And that's what we would call gender nonconforming, in the sense that there are traditions, there are ways in which we think people express their gender, either in their clothing, their hobbies, things like that, which are either consistent with the traditional way in which we think about gender, or in this case, non-conforming to that. Now, those girls, the ones that played ball with us at recess, the term in English, of course, is tomboy. I don't know how current that is, and I don't know what the equivalent, if any, there is in Spanish. But those girls who played ball with us, I mean, I suppose they could have been lesbians, they could have been transgender, but I never thought of them that way, and I still don't think that's the right way to think of them. I think, if anything, at least in that part of their life, they were gender nonconforming because they weren't interested in jump rope or the things girls did. They wanted to do the kinds of things that boys did. And that's what we mean, I think, about gender nonconformity. So the last term here is queer. It's not a term that I personally use unless I know that the individual that I'm referring to thinks of that as a term that is part of how they identify. And that is partially age-related. That is to say, it's a generational thing within the LGBTQI communities. There are some, it was a slur, right? A term of derision, which has been reclaimed for people, but not for all people. So it's the kind of thing that I would not use unless I knew that the individual who I was identifying in that way identified that way themselves. Doesn't mean that you don't have to, and that the reason I'm giving you this terminology, by the way, is so that you have these terms available to you should you want to use them, right? I always think it is much better to be prepared and to understand these concepts and to be able to figure the terminology out than to be faced with something kind of as a surprise. So this is the terminology part that goes along with the other. And I'll stop here and take questions because I saw that there were a bunch of questions, right? So there's a question about domestic violence or intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ communities. I hate to say this, but that is actually part of my presentation in 2 weeks. So I'd like to hold that in a larger way. Is it similar? Yes. Are there differences? Absolutely. And we can talk about what those differences are. And I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, by the way, about that. So then there's, oh, okay. So there's something that's a relatively easy thing. So one of the questions is, what's the difference between gender expression and gender identity? So gender identity is how you think of yourself. Do you think of yourself as male? Do you think of yourself as female? That's related to, but it doesn't have to be, to how you present to the outside world, which is your gender expression. So, for example, I could think of myself as a woman. I could still have a beard because I may express my gender in traditionally masculine ways, even though I think of myself as a man. Or I could prefer or feel more comfortably. So, for example, there are lesbians that I know of who are women who are they definitely see themselves as women. They are women who are attracted to other women. So they're clearly female identified in terms of gender identity. However, they don't feel comfortable in dresses. They never wear dresses. They wear pants. They wear sometimes very masculine shoes. They would feel much more comfortable going to court in a suit, a man's suit. They still think of themselves as women, but they just don't express their gender in traditionally feminine ways. And so gender expression is the sort of outside presentation of your gender. Gender identity is kind of what's on the inside. Yes, so there's an interesting question about fathers' last names in same-sex couples. And honestly, I know nothing about that. I'd love to learn more about it. And in fact, I didn't know that was an issue, and apparently it is one in Ecuador. So I would be very curious as to finding out more and seeing what that looks like. So there's a question that I'm not sure how to answer in one sense. So the question is, what's my view on minor attracted persons movement to include pedophilia as a recognized sexual orientation of the LGBT community? I know what my personal belief is. My personal belief is that that's not a sexual orientation. And therefore is not part of the community in that way. But beyond, sort of my beliefs, I don't think that's what people think about. I think that's a political movement to include it within the LGBT community. And I'm not sure that people who study sexuality, which is not me, by the way, people who are really experts in human sexuality and things like that, would consider that to be a sexual orientation as much as it's something else. That's, I guess, all I can say about that. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about trans people in general. And in the United States, right, it's about 0.56%, right, which doesn't seem like it's that much. And this map, by the way, shows you the percentages. It's slightly higher, believe it or not, in Georgia, in California, et cetera. I don't, unfortunately, have this data on Puerto Rico. So I am sorry about that, but I do have some data on Puerto Rico. So what do we know about the percentage of people in Puerto Rico who are transgender? It's about 0.53% from the data that we do have, which means that it's slightly less, although not meaningfully less, it's not statistically important. It's about the same as in the United States generally. That's approximately, according to 2020 population figures, which is what we have, 15,000 people and change, right? That's a hard number to sort of get your head around, but that would be approximately the size of these municipalities, right? So if that helps sort of put this in context, that's not an insignificant number of people. And so when you're thinking about, am I going to see these folks in my courtroom? I think the answer is yes. Whether you have seen trans people already, I don't know. I'd be interested to find out. But I think more and more, particularly for people who see a lot of younger people, you probably have, or if you deal with youth, you probably have already seen transgender youth, or perhaps gender non-binary youth. So I think if you haven't seen these folks in your courtroom now, I would not be surprised if you saw them in the next coming years, right? So I want to talk a little bit about transition. And by transition, I mean the process of aligning a person's gender identity with their physical body, the sex they were assigned at birth, and figuring out how to do that and how to deal with gender expression and all of those things. I should say, by the way, that in terms of the terms, we don't tend to use the term gender change anymore, like gender change surgery. Excuse me. The term that tends to be used is either gender confirmation surgery or gender reassignment surgery. And that's trying to reflect this idea. When you ask most transgender people, not all, because of course nobody is 100% everything. But when you ask transgender people, they would tell you that they, for example, I have a friend, a former colleague who was assigned male at birth, and then he transitioned. And she was a colleague again after the transition. We were good friends beforehand. And so she came into my office one day and said, ask me any question that you want. And kind of stupid me, I asked some terrible questions, but okay. But I asked her, when was the time that you sort of knew that the gender you felt yourself as being is not the gender that everybody else thought you were, the gender you were assigned at birth? And she told me the story. She said, look, I never thought that I was a boy, even as a young child. On my birthday, you know, you have a cake and you have birthday candles, and you blow out, you close your eyes, you blow out the candles and make a wish, and it's supposed to come true. She said to me, every single birthday that I can remember, my wish was always the same. I would close my eyes and I would wish that when I opened them, I would physically be a girl. And she said, that happened to me from the first birthday that I can remember doing that kind of thing. So the idea of gender confirmation transition or gender reassignment transition is the idea that people are not changing genders, they're simply conforming maybe their physical body, maybe their gender expression to the gender that they think of in their head, their gender identity. So there are a number of things in transition. First of all, I guess that's the first thing to know about it. Transition is a function of lots of different stuff. This stuff over here in green is what we typically call social transition. That is changing names or pronouns or your appearance or your clothes and ID documents, etc. And this stuff over here is what we think of medical transitions, right? Hormones, sometimes surgery. It's important to kind of recognize that they're not the same, and that in fact, a person can be transgender and do some of these and not others, or in fact, do none of them. Because the idea of being transgender is you think in your head, you're one sex or one gender, and that's different from your physical body. And sometimes you want to realign them, and sometimes you don't, and sometimes you do that in social transition, but not medical transitions. The two in red, though, are where the courts come into play, typically, right? Name changes are court proceedings, and sometimes changing identity documents, not literally. The court is probably not going to literally change an identity document, but in order to change ID documents, you may need a court order changing the name, or you may need a court order of some basis. So the court's only involved in at least in a typical situation, a small portion of this, but those are important portions because they have to do with names and identities, right? So, as I said, there are many ways of transition or affirming gender. One of the questions that I remember talking to my colleague about, and that I wish I hadn't said, but okay, you live and learn, is this. We sometimes say to trans people, so have you had the surgery? And it's always the surgery. The truth is, what I'm really asking is, so tell me about your genitals. And we would never ask that of a person, right? I'm embarrassed to say I asked that of my former colleague years ago because I didn't know any better. I do now, and I recognize that that's really not an appropriate question to ask people. And what I think it shows, by the way, is that we sometimes simply don't think through what we're doing because it just doesn't occur to us, right? That to me, that seemed like a perfectly normal question. I don't think it is at this point in my life. So one of the things that's true is that identity documents don't really often reflect who somebody is, right? And what their lived experiences are. And that for many transgender people, the most important priority for them is social transition. In other words, realigning their name and their pronouns and how they express their gender, and much less about the legal transition, that is to say, the part that the courts would be involved with, changing identity documents, officially changing the name, and that it may take some time before everything matches. And in fact, they may never match. And it's really hard to think of what that looks like if you think about matching for identity documents for people who are non-conforming or gender non-binary. There may be always a difference for them in what their ID document says and how they think of themselves or express their gender in other ways. That, I think, causes a problem for courts, right? So I think it's one last poll here. So the question is, so if we could put up the poll. while that's going up. The question is, after transition, right? How many people in the United States generally, including Puerto Rico, change all their documents to be consistent with their gender identity? And once again, I'm interested in what your thoughts are, not that you know the real answer. So I see a bunch of people weighing in. Okay, things seem to have slowed down a little bit. I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So the majority of people, that's right, the plurality of people, the highest percentage of people is 31% saying it's 12%, right? And actually, I'll stop sharing, get rid of this poll. That's absolutely the right answer. Now, just because that's the right answer, the question is, what does it mean in terms of you as a judge? Well, I think it means something pretty dramatic. 12% after transition don't have documents that all match their gender identity. That means for you as a judge, it is incredibly likely that when you have a case involving a transgender person, it would be an unusual situation for the name on the case caption, for the name in the court records, to accurately be connected to the individual who appears in front of you, which means that that's going to be one of the issues you're going to need to think about and need to think about how to address that. Right, so here's the various places and the various situations which this happens, right? There's name change petitions. There's changing your birth certificate, which is a relatively recent possibility in Puerto Rico, is changing your driver's license, right? So what do we know data-wise? We know that 67% of people who were asked in a nationwide survey, trans people, said that none of their identification documents had the right name or sex, and that it was primarily a cost question. I would say 32%. And that when this happened, because of this disjuncture between their ID documents on one hand and who they were on another, there were all these negative things that followed from that. In fact, this same colleague of mine that I talked about before, she told me that for a long time, until she could get her driver's license changed, and she was a lawyer, she's a law professor, she had every ability to do it. It's just that, as we said before, her priorities were somewhat elsewhere. But until she could get her driver's license changed, she would not drive because she was terrified of being stopped by the police and asked to show her ID document, and that would be an ID document with her former name, her former gender, and that would not match who she was and who appeared in front of the cop, right? And that consequence and all of these things that people have, when they appear in your courtroom, they bring all these experiences with them. And in fact, one of the things that we know, and we'll talk about that in just a second, is people expect pretty unfair treatment in the courts of this country. So I want to talk about that. What do we know about that? Well, we know that almost 20%, 19% of participants in this big national transgender study, which I'm happy to give to people, heard a judge or lawyer or court user make negative comments about someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, or how the gender identity was expressed. And that's a pretty significant thing. As judges, you're well aware of the idea that how people feel they were treated in the court, including whether they think the court sees them accurately as a person, whether they're able to tell their side of the story, what we call procedural fairness, that those are the major ways in which people both perceive the courts and perceive the institution, the institution of justice in general. And that if we have a chunk of people who think these are my experiences in the court, that of course means that people come before you with all these fears, with all these concerns, and all these issues about being treated fairly in the courtroom. So what else do we know? We know that intersectionality, that is to say the combination of sexual orientation or gender and other aspects of people's racial or ethnic group, increase the poor treatment or the perception of poor treatment. And so here's data about that. And of course, in 2 weeks, as I said, we're going to talk more about how these things combine. But today, this is the information that we have about how people were treated that they believed in the court. All right, so I'm going to stop and take a few questions where I'm conscious of the time and I want to make sure that we have things. So one of the things, and I can hold this to the end, but I do think it's true, is that people's perception of who judges are and what courts are like, they're based on the same thing that we all base stuff on. The images that we see, the images of courts, what we think is the truth. And that may or may not be true, but if we're people who do not have large experience with the courts, then of course, that's all we have to go on. And that is part and parcel of why I think it is important both for judges to know who's in their courtroom, but for people to know who judges are. And actually that is as good a lead in as I can imagine to what I want to talk about, which is what are the tools that you have as judges to deal with some of these issues. So I want to start with some sort of basic starting points, right? That for the most part, and I think it's actually really true, that trans and gender nonconforming court users are basically not very different from everybody else. That is to say, they have the same need for respect, for effective interactions, for efficient judicial services, to get their cases heard. All of this stuff is the same. They have the same needs. It's true, however, that sometimes the problems that they have in institutions, including courts, comes not so much from themselves as much as people's discomfort or uncertainty with them, right? And that's based in part, as we were talking about, in past experiences and this fear that if I become visible as a trans person, or if I become visible as a gender nonconforming person, and it's true for LGBT people, that if I become visible as a lesbian, etc., I'm going to be treated differently. And so people tend to go in the closet. One of the things that we know from almost every court study that I've ever seen is that people who are out in every facet of their life, when they show up in court, they all of a sudden want to go back in the closet. Right now, some people can't, and some people don't think that way. But of course, there's a big fear of, well, but if people know who I am, I'm going to be treated differently or I'm going to be treated worse. And that as judges, and for that matter, as law professors, but as judges, we're in charge of this stuff. And sometimes it's up to us to remove those barriers or to overcome those barriers in order to give effective access to these people in our courtrooms, right? So I have a discussion question, which unfortunately we can't discuss, but I'll leave it to you to think about what your answers would be. So the question is, you can read it. The case is called of Carlos Rivera Sanchez, and a litigant who is appearing for themselves without a lawyer appears in your courtroom and with a feminine hairstyle and lipstick and a dress and high heels, etc. Question I have for you is, what do? Think about what you might do in this situation. And the second question goes along with it. What if that person tells you that they're called Camila Rivera Sanchez? And then lastly, in terms of thinking about this kind of a situation in your courtroom, what if the other attorney insists on calling this person Carlos and El? Right? What is your thoughts about what you might do as a judge? What you might do in this kind of a situation? How do you handle it? The reason that I bring it up is, of course, as I said before, I always think it's important to think about these things before they happen. And I'll think about how you might deal with this situation. So the question, I guess, is beginning with, how do you address people you don't know, especially in the kind of situation that we're talking about in this scenario? So I think the most obvious solution, and I'm sure this is a solution you've thought about, is you simply ask, what would you like me to call you? How should I address you? Right? I mean, yes, it's true that can be kind of an off-putting question. It can be kind of a difficult question in a way. But on the other hand, people who are transgender or people who are gender non-conforming, they probably expect you're going to do much worse, and that it's a perfectly appropriate thing to simply say, how would you like me to call you? One other thing you might think about doing is, if you're in the habit, and personally I am, and it's a hard habit to break for me, to not use honorific titles that are gender-based, right? Sir or ma'am in English, señor, señora, and don, doña. There are other ways of doing that. And then you might think about identifying people in terms of their role, right? The minor, the accused, the witness, etc. Right? The bigger question is, like, what does this person, how do they see themselves? What would you like me to call you? And then try and avoid, if possible, and it's not always possible, to avoid making gender kind of assumptions or binary gender ideas in the questions that you ask. So I want to talk a little bit about names and pronouns. All right. I think in general, we tend to respect the way people identify themselves. I have a very good friend whose name is Stephen. No one, well, his mother, but other than his mother, no one calls him Stephen. Everyone calls him Steve. I don't see any reason why to insist, oh, but your name is Stephen, I'm going to call you Stephen, even though that's not how they call themselves. We would do that for him. I'm not sure why it's really any different realistically in any other situation. I think the next point is also true. If you make a mistake, and you will, we always do, you excuse yourself and you try harder the next time, right? What's really important, and parents know this about kids, but it's also important in the general world, that people are very conscious of how others perceive them and what they talk about them, how they talk about them, and things of that nature. For trans and gender nonconforming people, this is a really important thing that they carry around with them. What's going to happen to me if this? Are people going to know I'm trans? Are whatever? Am I going to be insulted? Am I going to be misgendered? So we have to be careful that what we say may be taken in a way that's completely different than what we think. So we sometimes say to trans people, right? Oh, I just can't seem to get your name and pronouns right. Often what's heard is something very different. Oh, you're just not important enough for me to try any harder than this. Now, that's not at all what we mean by that statement, but it can be perceived by the person who's being addressed in this way as something, it's like, it's not important to me to figure out how to do this right. And I think that idea of our words have consequences differently from what our intentions are is an important thing to keep in mind. You know that as judges, you're very aware of how people perceive you and how you're coming across. It's really no different in this kind of a situation. I hesitated about this. So, gender, these are gender nonconforming people, right? The question of pronouns, I think for transgender people, is relatively simple. That is to say, unless there's a reason why you need to use a different pronoun, you use the pronouns that are appropriate for the individual in front of you. So somebody who identifies as a woman, you use the word she. Right? The harder question, I think, is for people who are non-binary. And the reason I hesitate is I'm not sure, honestly, how much of an issue this is for you. It's an issue for mainland judges in English, because we have he and she, just like, of course, you do in Spanish. But the term that's a non-binary term has tended to be now settled on the use of they. So instead of saying, I don't know, person X, he wants to go to the store, you say person X, they want to go to the store. For people who identify in that way and for whom they is the pronoun, the gender non-binary pronoun that they prefer. I don't know where, so I'm not a native Spanish speaker, obviously. There are terms in Spanish that are being used. I'm not sure where they are. The reason that I'm including this, honestly, is what we talked about before. In English, we have the expression, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You have one in Spanish, más vale prevenir que lamentar. I think it's important to think about this before this shows up. So from what I can tell, right, there's suggestion, and I don't know how far along it is, and I don't know how widely common it is, but there's a suggestion to use the letter E to create pronouns that are gender neutral in Spanish. And that you could use these pronouns if people wanted you to identify non-binary persons or persons who would not identify as masculine or feminine, right? Because of course, in Spanish, as in English, you need to make a choice, right? He or she. But I guess so this is what it looks like. To a non-Spanish speaker, to me, this looks incredibly weird. But I guess the important thing, the reason that I even bring it up, is that in this situation, like anyone else, any other situation, if a person comes into your courtroom and says, this is how I would like you to refer to me, you can ask yourself, is it possible for me to do this? Right? And if it's not possible, can I explain why it's not possible? Right? I mean, in other words, it's in a way not that different than transgender people, right? And if you can, you use the pronouns just like you'd use the name for a person who is in front of you as how they identify. Whether this is the appropriate way to do it, I don't know. This is what I have seen most commonly. And so I offer it to you. Some of you have seen these terms before, others of you may not have. Okay. This, I think, is the key point. There are lots of times, maybe not as many as we think, but there are times in which you do have to use the name of a court user that is their original name or the name that's in the court records or whatever in order to do things. My guideline to you, and it's because it's my guideline for myself, is to be transparent. In other words, can you tell this person why you need this information and what you're going to do with it? So for example, I need to match your name with the court records in order to whatever, or your documentation has a name, a different name or gender than the one that I have in the court records. Can you help me understand, right? In other words, the idea of misgendering, court records are court records and you need to match them appropriately. There's lots of things you need to do. What you can do though is be open and transparent about why you're doing something. So the individual in front of you knows why it is you need to use this name or why it is you need to use that name and what it's going to be used for. And I think that's one of the key parts about this. Well, I know we're almost out of time. I want to leave time for questions. I have another situation about this, right? So you can read it, right? You have a case in which there's a loan taken out on the 1st of December for Luis Vasquez Colon, the person who is the defendant here. The person comes in front of you and they say their name is Luisa, and you're trying to figure this out. How do you do it? Right? I give you 4 choices. Were you Luis Vasquez Colon when you took out this loan? Is this your signature on the document? How did you call yourself? Or what were you called on the 1st of December? Did you take out this loan? Right? I think that's what we should ask ourselves. What is the actual information that you need? Do you really need to know what the former name was? Or do you need to know what person signed or took out the loan? Right? And if the name is important, once again, can we be transparent about what we're going to use it for or why it's important in this way? Right? So one thing about that transgender study is they had people explain what were the kinds of things that they felt were that they understood to be discrimination when they were in the courtrooms. So the first was misgendering by parties or by witnesses or by the lawyers in the case, and that a similar things that sometimes happened with judges is that judges were asking them to justify why the name, the pronoun, things like that were so important to them. That there were answers like, why is this so important? Why can't you just sort of put up with your former name for the time you're in court? Or why do we have to deal with this question, right? That's not misgendering, but it is sort of diminishing and putting the burden on the individual to justify why they are who they are in that way. Another thing is adding gender or sexual orientation into cases where it's not relevant because the person happens to be a member of the LGBTTQ plus communities, or sort of ignoring it when it is relevant, right? So once again, it's like, this isn't the dominant issue, then okay, let's not make it one. Or this is an important part. For example, and we're going to talk about this, as I said, in 2 weeks. If you have a domestic violence case, and that was one of the questions, domestic violence in same-sex couples in many ways is very much like in heterosexual couples, but not always. And the dynamics are different. And so that where they're different, we should be familiar with what they are. Lastly, right? Because you're a judge, you're in control of the courtroom, and people look to you for the sort of tenor of the courtroom, for the way the courtroom operates, for what you think is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, right? One of the things that people mentioned was they felt that judges sort of let slide comments by attorneys or comments by witnesses or whatever, and that made them feel not respected in the courtroom. That, of course, is not different than other people who might feel not respected in the courtroom, but it's one of the things that people pointed out as they felt that this was discriminatory action by a judge. So the last point that I want to make, see if you can be a bridge, right? See if you can close the gap between LGBTTIQ court users and the judicial system. Now, you're familiar with this because honestly, right, as we said before, when people and their families show up in court or in the judicial system, it's not because they're happy. Well, adoptions possibly, but in general, they're a crisis. That's true for everybody. In these situations then, right, we sometimes forget that for us, the court and court processes are normal, right? They're familiar. We know what's supposed to happen. We know what the process is. But for most people who show up in court, it's a completely new experience. It's very disconcerting to wonder, what am I supposed to do here? What's going to happen to me? What is this person going to ask me? What am I going to be called, right? And that's particularly true for people who are afraid of how people are going to be treated, or how people are going to treat them, I should say. And that, for better or for worse, those are going to be the LGBT people who show up in your courtroom. And it's then up to us as people who are familiar with the system to sort of reach out and see if we can help provide greater access to these folks.